I'm about to show you many things to attempt if your L1 or R1 buttons on your DualShock 4 controller is having an issue. Issues such as not registering a push on its own, being stuck, not bouncing back into position, or making an odd noise. Try the solutions I show you in the order that I show them because they kind of build on one another. The first several things don't involve taking things apart, but later on I'll have you going inside and doing things there. So keep going through each solution until your problem is resolved or until you reach the end of your comfort level with working with an electronic device. For many of you, this first thing will fix your issue. Grab some thin cardboard from like any kind of product you have in your home and cut it into a wedge. And then stick that wedge into the gap around whatever button is giving you the issue and move it around. The idea here is to scrape away any residue that has built up on the inside. Sometimes that interferes with the proper movement of the button. If the corner on your wedge starts to get damaged, switch to another corner. You don't want pieces of cardboard getting inside your controller. After doing all this, check to see if that fixed the issue. If it didn't, move on to solution 2. This time you're going to apply suction to the gap using a vacuum cleaner nozzle, assuming you own a vacuum cleaner that has one. Press the button up and down as you do this. Full suction might be a little bit too much, so if you have the ability to turn the suction down on your vacuum cleaner, go ahead and do that. This is a good follow-up to the first solution because you may have scraped some residue off and it might be loose and laying inside there right now. Solution 3 is the opposite of solution 2. This time you're going to blow into the gap. You can use a straw, you can use canned air, you can use a hairdryer as long as you have it on the cold setting. Some people like to put their whole mouth on the controller and just blow that way. I recommend the straw over all of these because it concentrates the air into one spot. This is also a good time to hit that like button if you're getting a lot out of this video. Thank you. This one is a long shot, but I wanted to put it in here because this is the last thing you can try before going inside the controller. There's a little hole on the back. At the end of that hole is a button, and if you stick something in there and hold that button for 5 seconds, it resets the controller. I'm using a little tiny nail, but if you have a needle or something like that, it'll also work. By the way, if your controller has a dead battery, this will not work. So make sure it's charged at least a little bit. Now in doing this, your controller may forget what it was previously connected to, so you may have to do the pairing process all over again. If nothing has worked so far, the next step is to go inside and attempt various things like cleaning and replacing parts. Be warned though, anytime you go inside a compact electronic device, there is some risk of breaking something, or you may just make your problem worse. I will say I'm going to do my best to be very detailed and show you all the things I've learned over the years to minimize that risk. Also note that they made these DualShock 4s over a series of many years, and during that time they made different revisions of the board, so along the way I'm going to point out some of those differences when it's important enough to mention. Just like every controller on the planet pretty much, the DualShock has 2 halves. And the first step is to separate those 2 halves. It's going to make your life a lot easier if you scrape out any gunk that has accumulated in the gap between those halves. That gunk can kind of act like a glue and make it hard to pull them apart. So just take any kind of small sharp instrument and run it along the fault line there. Same goes with the screws. Clean up any crud that has accumulated around them. Here's the 4 spots where the outside screws are. Remove them with a small Phillips screwdriver. This is the size of the bit that I used. If one of the screws still doesn't want to budge, try dropping 1 drop of water on it, let it soak for a minute, and then wipe the water back out. And also tap on the screw. Next, you need to separate the two shells, but hold on for a second while I point some things out. There's plastic tabs that keep the two sides together. For some people, these tabs will feel very tight, and in some cases, they may break as you pull the two halves apart. If they do, I recommend you don't worry about it, because those tabs are really redundant. Your controller will still go back together just fine. In fact, a while back, I did an experiment where I broke off every tab intentionally, and I was still able to put my controller back together because the 4 screws hold it back together just fine. If you do break one of those tabs, make sure you don't leave the pieces of it inside the controller, just turn it over and shake it out. Also note, there's a ribbon cable that connects the two halves, so you don't want to yank them too far apart and snap that cable. Later on, we're going to unplug that cable. Another thing I want to point out is, for some of you, part of the shell goes in between the top buttons like this. If so, take special care not to pull it in a way that rips off the L2 and R2 buttons. We're going to remove one or more of those buttons anyway, but it's preferable not to rip them off in this way. If one comes off, just lay it aside. Also watch for any spring that falls out and set that aside if it does. And the final tip I'll give you is to try to make sure the buttons are facing down when you're separating. Otherwise, the battery might fall out. So start separating the two halves. The best place to start is in the handles where the two pieces come together. Try to do it by hand at first, but if it doesn't budge, try a prying tool if you have one around. When you get some separation, start applying more force, and it'll eventually just snap apart. Next, you'll need to disconnect the ribbon cable that connects the two halves. The best way to get the ribbon out is to pull on the little blue part. Don't pull it at an angle, pull it straight up. When you do get it out, try to remember which way the metal contacts were facing so that you can put it back in the right way when you put it back together. Lay the lower half aside and keep the buttons facing downward. Some of you have a loose reset button that may have fallen out during this process, or it may eventually fall out. If so, just lay it aside. We are almost where we need to be for this solution. You need to remove R2 or L2, whichever one is blocking your problematic button. There are two types of R2 and L2. Ones that have this long tail and ones that don't. If it has the tail, you can unsnap the button by pulling up on one side of it and then the other. You just kind of do a rocking motion. If it doesn't have the tail, it comes off without having to do the rocking motion. However, a spring may come off. If it does, just set it aside. It's very unlikely the buttons with the tails would have a loose spring come off because it just has a better design and it holds the spring into place better. Next, you'll need to remove the problematic R1 or L1 button. If you have this little bridge that's against it, that part needs to stay in place. And you'll need to stick a small screwdriver under the button in one corner and another screwdriver under the button in the other corner and pull upward. Most of the time, this will send your button flying across the room. Other times, it might just shift the button into an up position where you can just take it off with your fingers. If you have the type of controller that does not have that bridge right up against R1 or L1, then you don't really need to take two different screwdrivers to pry it out. You should be able to just pull it out with your finger. Clean that button with alcohol. Also inspect it for damage. If it is damaged, you can either get one from another controller or you can order a replacement. I'll put some affiliate links in the description to some of the replacement parts for this video. Bear in mind, you need to find one that matches your existing button exactly, because like I mentioned earlier, they made many revisions of the DualShock 4, so there's going to be some variation in the parts that are available to buy. There's at least 2 variations of this one particular button. Next, remove the padding that was under the button. It's likely got a lot of dust on it. Take it to the sink and clean it, and then dry it off before you do anything else with it. A lot of times we would clean things with alcohol, but I would not recommend putting alcohol on this rubber padding because it might damage the material. That's why we're using good old-fashioned water. Next, inspect that padding to see if it's damaged. look for a tiny little tear to it. There are two little black nubs on it. The one that's flat is the one that went under the R1 or L1. Make sure the black material isn't rubbed off, and make sure it reflexes back when you push on it. Replace it if needed, and like I just said, make sure you get a replacement that matches your version exactly. Next, clean the area where the button was with alcohol, including the edge of the plastic and the little contact point that's down in there. It is very likely that the things you have done up to this point have resolved the issue, but there is one more thing to try, which is to replace this film that goes under all the buttons. In order to get to that film, you'll need to move some more stuff out of the way. First, move the battery out of the way to expose the screw that's underneath. I used to tell people to disconnect the battery, but the connector can be very tight, and by removing it, you risk pulling the whole connector off the board. And if that happens, you have a pretty big problem. So we're just gonna keep the battery off to the side throughout this whole video. Unscrew that screw that's under the battery holder, then remove the holder itself. For some of you, it'll come right off. For others, it's snapped into place with pegs, and those pegs can be very tight. Try to remove it with your fingers, but if you can't, stick something in there and just pry it out. Next, disconnect this ribbon cable. Some of you will have a gate that needs to be opened before you can pull it out. If you have any other screws on your circuit board, go ahead and remove them at this time. Now lay the battery back onto the board where the holder was. Keep the buttons facing down, but push up on the analog sticks. This will separate the lower shell. Some of you will have a slot for this ribbon cable, and you'll have to feed it through that slot as you separate it, or else it might get snagged and rip off. You can now see most of the film, and you are ready to start removing it. But before you start doing that, just make sure you have a replacement lined up. For some people, it's one big piece. For others, it's two different pieces, and you may just need one of those two pieces. If you are ready to proceed, start removing the film by taking it off the pegs along the front line here. Just get it loose, don't pull it too much because parts of it are still embedded within parts of the controller. Get the whole front of it hanging off like this. Then untuck it from where the shoulder buttons were. You might need some tweezers here. The final part of the ribbon feeds inside the controller, and to free it, you'll need to turn everything around and pop this board out of place. On my version, it's held on by multiple tabs, so I can just push on those tabs and the board will come loose. You don't need to actually remove the board, you can just move it out of position a little bit. You can see that the film is coming through a slot and it's attached to two pegs, so remove it from those two pegs and feed it through the hole. With that board pulled out, you can check the version of it, and you can use that ID as part of your search for the replacement parts. Take your replacement film and put it into place, the opposite way in which you removed the other one. So that's all the fixes I have to suggest. For the rest of the video, I'm just going to show you how to put the controller back together. Push the board back into the tabs that hold it. Put the padding back into place. If you can't remember which end of it goes in first, take a look underneath and you'll see that one of the black nubs is flat and the other is curved. The flat one is what needs to go under the R1 or L1 button. Put the R1 and L1 back into place. put the L2 and R2 buttons back on. If you had the kind with the tails, they should snap right back into place easily. If you had the smaller kind without the tails, it's a little bit more challenging. There is a spring involved that may have fallen out. I'm going to assume the worst and tell you how to put that spring back in and place the button back into place. This upcoming segment is from an older video, so my voice may sound a little bit different. Tilt the button upside down so that you have the little pegs at the top. If it's R2, place the spring over the peg that's on the left, like so. If it's L2, put it on the right side peg. Don't do it this way. There's a little slot under that peg. One leg of the spring needs to go into that slot. It doesn't snap into it, it just kind of lays there loosely. Flip the button like this. There's a tiny slot on the controller side that the other leg of the spring fits into. Bring the controller up to it like this. You may need to hold the battery in place as you do this. Land the leg into the slot and snap the button into place. Place the inside frame back into place. Some of you will have to feed this ribbon cable through a little slot. Insert that ribbon cable back into its connector. Some of you have a gate that needs to be open when you stick it in, and once it's in, you shut the gate. Bear in mind that this connector leads to the touchpad. In the end, if the touchpad is not working, go back in and just check the way you plugged this ribbon in. Put the battery holder back on. Some of you will need to snap it into place. For everyone else, it just kind of lays there on top of the board. Put the screw back into place. Make sure you get it all the way in because it basically holds the whole thing together. Some of you will have a loose reset button that may have come out. Drop it back into place. Put the battery back into the holder and make sure the QR code on the battery is facing upward. There's a little bit of a hook that you can wrap the battery wires into. Take the other half of the shell and stick the ribbon cable that's on it into the connector that's on the other half. This is very tricky to do, and it's also where a lot of people make a mistake. There's metal contacts on one side of the ribbon, and they need to face a certain way, and for some of you, it's away from the battery, and for others, it's toward the battery. And it depends on what revision you have. If your connector is 100% vertical like this one, the metal contacts need to be facing the battery. If your connector is tilted like this one, the contacts should face away from the battery. By the way, this cable powers the light and the charging port, so if those things aren't functioning when this is all put together, come back and make sure that this cable is secure and facing the right direction. Place the two halves back together. They just kind of snap into place, and then put these 4 screws back into place. And that's all I had for you. I hope you found the video helpful. If you did, please hit that like button. I'll see you around.